Chapter 16. Once Upon a Dream. Philip and Joanna reached the crossroads an hour before dawn. She took the main road that led around the woods surrounding Altor and King Stephan's castle, and Philip bid her farewell with a promise to be safe. He ventured into the old woods, the trees as crowded and dark as his thoughts. He spent the next 3 days trekking through them in near total silence. There was no world in which he would ever stomach what he had done. Philip had been tricked and had cursed them as effectively as Maleficent had. His only hope was getting the armaments back to Altor. Philip had never shown an interest in ruling, not since he was a bright-eyed, naive boy. So it was no wonder his father had never told him about old Bartleby and the Sword of Truth, or King Stephan's plans to get the Shield of Virtue. All those times Eris and the others had applauded his progress had been little more than a prank. He wasn't gifted at all. If Philip had paid attention, he refused to learn magic, or been a son his father could trust, then none of this would have happened. Instead, he had spent the past 3 days traveling and looking over his shoulder for furious, murderous fairies. It was his final day in the forest, and he had seen neither wand nor wing of the fairies. Hopefully, this last morning of travel would be as excitingly as the others. Today is Princess Aurora's birthday, and at dusk, Maleficent's curse will take effect. We have to get to the castle before that, he said to Samson, combing through the horse's mane with his fingers. This is what I get for learning. Samson flicked his ears and shook his head. Not that you have to worry about that, Philip patted Samson's side. There's not much horses can learn. At least Philip knew how to travel inconspicuously. He had tossed aside the cat-shaped brooch Eris had given him that first day before he entered the forest. Abandoning it felt oddly final. Walking along with Samson eased some of his sadness and rage, but they were still knotted up inside him like a bramble growing around his heart. The nights had been the worst. He hadn't been able to sleep much, and in the few hours he had gotten, he hadn't dreamed of the forest, Briar Rose, or anything else. The fear that she was another trick lingered in the back of his mind. As he lay in the dark with no one but a snoring horse and the stars for company, his thoughts spiraled into all the different what could have beens that would never be, and all the moments when the people he had trusted were actually laughing at him. Eris at least liked him enough to turn on Poanna and Frank to protect him. But he had learned she also wasn't the sort to tell the truth. If she had really been working for Maleficent the whole time, he wasn't sure he could trust anything she had said. And then there was the fact that he'd used her confession not just to escape, but to abscond with the sword and shield. It's not even that she believed in me, Philip muttered to Samson. He collapsed over the horse's back and let his arms fall to the sides. She figured me out so quickly and knew exactly what I needed and wanted. Why hasn't anyone like my father been able to do that? If someone bad enough to side with Maleficent was the only one who knew him that well, was he bad? She had seen him fall head over backside into the mud, leap from a tower, and shout vines many times. He had been vulnerable with her like he was with few people. Briar Rose knows me as well as she does, I guess, he mumbled into Samson's neck. And she's not even a little bit bad. At his meanest, he would have called Briar Rose aggressively kind. Knowing that someone as good as Briar Rose could see him at his worst moments and tolerate him, maybe even like him, eased some of the pain. Shaking his head, Samson bumped Philip back all the way into the saddle and snorted. Come on, said Philip. Only a few more hours in these woods until we stop for the day. This far northeast, the landscape was craggy hills speckled with thick old forests. Trees older than time shaded them from the sun, and the river they were following had cut through the earth so long before that the shoreline was smooth and overgrown with moss and ferns. Spring was already in bloom here, flowers taking hold in the rug-like grass, and bees fluttering from bush to bramble. Birds sang overhead. It reminded him of what the dream wood had looked like before the maze appeared. There was a peacefulness that it made him want to linger. He wanted to talk to Briar Rose so badly it hurt. She knew him, and she would understand how hurt and terrified he was. He needed to know that she was real and was all right. Philip closed his eyes and took a steadying breath, leaning down over Samson's back again. A familiar voice rang out through the woods. Philip blinked and sat up. Had he fallen asleep while riding again? "You hear that, Samson?" he asked, and pulled the horse to a stop. "Beautiful." Samson paced backward and shook his head, huffing. He tugged the reins forward. Philip twisted in the saddle and stood, trying to see where the singer was or get a better angle to hear them from. Samson tried to walk on. "What is it?" Philip had to yank the reins to pull Samson around. "Come on, let's find out." Samson snorted, shook his head, and dragged them to the path they had been following. "Oh, come on." Philip held his reins tight and tried to turn him, but Samson held firm. The horse walked them a few more strides. Philip leaned down and patted his neck. "For an extra bucket of oats?" Philip nearly laughed when Samson's head bobbed. "And a few carrots?" Samson nodded, and Philip sat back in the saddle. "Hup, boy!" They rode back the way they had come, toward the voice. Samson, at least, would forever be predictable and bribable. The horse's motive was always clear: food. The person singing moved through the woods at a steady pace, but was clearly across the river. Samson charged on with single-minded precision, and Philip tried to squash the hope blooming in his chest. It couldn't be Briar Rose, no matter how much he wanted to talk to her right then. "I can't get my hopes up," he mumbled, ignoring the disappointment that gripped him. He just wanted to talk to someone who knew what was going on, and he was clearly imagining Briar Rose's voice. It's not her. It can't be her. Samson pulled up near an outcropping of rocks as the voice echoed around them, and suddenly he was off, galloping through the underbrush. He leapt over a fallen tree on the riverbank, and a branch caught Philip in the chest. Philip scrambled for a hold on the tree, but lost it. He plummeted into the shallow offshoot of the chute of the river. "Whoa!" he shouted, and spat out a mouthful of leaves and water. Samson's frantic hoofbeats stopped. Philip groaned, pushing himself up into a seated position. Now both his pride and his back ached. Samson picked his way through the water to Philip with delicate little splashes. He pulled off Philip's sopping wet hat. Philip glared up at him. He and Samson had been in tournaments and ridden through far denser woods, and it had been ages since Philip had fallen off. He splashed Samson. "No carrots," he said, taking his hat. "We'll see about the oats." Samson huffed, and Philip rose, rolling his eyes. Philip leaned against Samson and dragged himself from the water. He was lucky it wasn't still freezing. Philip peeled off his damp cloak and set it out on a branch to dry. The singing had stopped. Philip sat down on a nearby rock to dry off and get control of his thoughts. It couldn't be Briar Rose. There was no way her aunts had kept her that close to civilization when they thought it was too dangerous. It could be a trap. Some new torture Maleficent had orchestrated on finding out he had slipped away from her minions with the sword and shield. Eris might have changed her mind about helping him when she realized the armaments were gone. Those were ultimately what she had been after. "What do you think?" he asked Samson. Samson huffed and nudged Philip's foot. "I'm not arriving home damp and disappointing." Philip waved a hand at the sun. "I'll dry out soon enough and we can go then. I know you're excited to be stabled, but I'm not thrilled about seeing my father. Or Princess Aurora's parents. Or Princess Aurora." Philip lay in a patch of sun. Even if he did find Briar Rose, would she want to talk to someone so self-absorbed he had fallen for Maleficent's tricks? Over the past few days of travel, his anger had cooled to a grief-tinging defeat. "I'm wallowing," he said, eyeing Samson. "You made me wallow." Philip tossed his hat up onto the tree with his cloak and crawled up to sit on the roots of a gnarled old tree. Samson drank from the river, ignoring him. "You know, Samson," he said, and emptied the water from his boots. There was something strange about that voice, too beautiful to be real. Maybe it was a mysterious being, a wood sprite, or... Samson snorted and neighed, staring at something behind Philip, and Philip spun. It would be just his luck, for 2 rabbits were running off with his boots, and his cloak was flying away, as if even his clothes had grown tired of him. He stumbled to his feet. "Hey!" he shouted. "Stop!" He chased after them. The hat and boots hopped up a steep hill and vanished. The cape fluttered far too high for him to reach, tail feathers stinging out the back. Normal animals didn't rob humans of their clothes. But there was no charge to the air that came with magic. Samson cantered after Philip. If it was magic, it didn't affect horses. "No one finds out about this," muttered Philip. He spun, grabbed Samson's head, and bumped his nose against the horses. "I can't be the prince who got robbed by a pack of rabbits." Samson huffed. The singing started again, slight and near. It was over the hill where his clothes had vanished. Philip crept toward the hill. Wood Witch? Samson let out a shallow groan. The singing trailed off, and someone babbled behind the thick greenery. Philip snuck as close as he dared. Hiding in a tangle of plants beside a tree, he pushed the leaves out of his way. Briar Rose, awake and real, and looking as she had at the end of the maze, danced through the woods and sang to a small choir of creatures ampling after her in Philip's stolen clothes. It was her voice. It was her face. And it was definitely her floppy-eared rabbit ears, hopping in one of his boots. Her bare feet shuffled over thick grass. As she bowed with the rhythm of the song, pale gold hair spilled over her shoulders and curled like ferns at the ends against a plain linen dress. The arch of her arms as she danced was as self-assured as her words had been all those times they had whispered through the wall. And an owl in Philip's cloak gathered itself up until it was her height. It and the other creatures danced around her. The words of the song pierced Philip's heart like an arrow. "Once upon a dream," he muttered, and hit Samson's shoulder. "She's singing about me, right?" Samson snorted. Oh. He wasn't quite certain this quiet, creeping feeling was friendship, but it was something akin to it that he didn't know. Sweet and bitter. His admiration of her studies, his prior fury at her seeing his most vulnerable and embarrassing moments. There was absolutely no anger now. He hadn't appreciated her at once. She had grown on him, the way certain mushrooms grew on roots and allowed both plants to thrive. Oh no, that was a terrible metaphor. He'd have to ask Joanna for a better one. Briar Rose spun around. Philip darted forward, seizing his chance in the back of his cloak. He gently moved the owl's side and waited for the steps of Briar Rose's dance to return her to him. She twirled into the circle of his arms, and Philip caught her wrists in his hands, loosely so as not to frighten her too badly. It was an old court dance, one he hadn't seen since he was a child, but remembered enough of the steps, too. He stepped behind her, interrupted her song. She stiffened, glancing at the owl in his cloak off to the side, and gasped. "Oh," she said, pulling away from Philip and then hesitating. Her brows were pinched together in confusion, but she wasn't scared or angry. She was meeting his eyes as if waiting for something from him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she lifted one brow. "I'm awfully sorry," he said so sincerely it was clear he didn't mean it. I didn't mean to frighten you. Oh, it wasn't that, she said, and dropped her gaze. It's just that you're, He narrowed his eyes, ignoring the sting of her not recognizing him. Had his dreams been only that? His dreams alone? A stranger? He asked. She hummed, and he laughed softly. But don't you remember? We've met before. He needed her to know. Briar Rose had been his constant companion even before they could communicate. Friend or foe, he wanted to know her in real life. We have? She asked, still poised to leave. But despite her stance, there was a quirk to her lips and a glint in her eyes that let him know she knew exactly who he was. He swallowed his retort. No more assumptions. This was Briar Rose, who had never met another person in real life. Of course she was nervous. But of course, you said so yourself. He held onto one of her hands, lacing their fingers as she had when they met at the end of the maze. Her hand felt nearly the same, though there were calluses he hadn't felt before. A few dark stains from ink or berries marred her skin. He liked how much more real it all made her. He tugged slightly, and she took a step closer. Once upon a dream. Her violet eyes widened. Her hand squeezed his. She pursed her lips to keep from smiling and darted away from him, then hid behind a tree, barely in sight. Her fingers crooked and beckoned him. I know you, he said. He went around the side of the tree and touched her hand. She inhaled, her mouth pinched in surprise. Slowly, she raised her eyes to his. Hope lit them from within. He offered her his hand. She smiled wildly and for that real then, truly happy to see him. She took his hand and they spun into the dance again around a small lake. Her fingers tightened around his shoulder, and a flush as pale as sunrise was spreading across her cheeks. Philip? He said, and pulled her close. I'm your dream prince with... Well, you're the one with a mischievous gleam in her eyes. Are you real? How are you here? She asked, laughing and sliding her hand over his shoulder. Am I real? Asked the girl who didn't recognize the boy she'd been dreaming about all of their lives, said Philip, pulling her closer. It's been only 3 days since we spoke last. It seemed ridiculous now to have ever read malice into her words. He had ascribed the feelings he felt about himself to her. Oh, hush. She squeezed his hand as he spun her again. This feels exceptionally dreamlike. They walked toward the edge of the cliff hand in hand, letting the few minutes pass in silence. In the distance, the tall white towers of King Stephan's estate glittered against a foggy lavender sky. Dreamy, am I? Philip grinned. A lot happened. I'm traveling to Altor to speak with my father and King Stephan. I can't believe you live so near to King Stephan's castle. How have you not walked over there? I'm not supposed to, she said, and he remembered how often her studies had been about obedience, honor, and trust. My aunts always find me first anyway. Aren't you supposed to be training? He winced. That went quite badly, actually. I seem to have been tricked. What? She asked. Once, he would have mistaken her tone for one of judgment, but the look on her face made it clear she was worried for him. It's a long story, he said. How much time do you have? I live alone in a wood that I'm not allowed to leave, she gestured for him to sit. How much time do you think I have? Well, it's not that long. He helped her sit and then joined her in the grass. You're smart. You might have a better plan than me. Philip told Briar Rose mostly everything. He was scared to tell her of all his failures, but she looked at him with such trust and curiosity that his worry faded to comfort. She would understand better than anyone how he felt, and it made him feel safe. Their meeting was a respite in the middle of the disaster that was his life. Beneath his comfort stirred another emotion, one he didn't recognize and couldn't name, that warmed his heart and reassured him that he wouldn't be facing his uncertain future alone. He didn't tell her that he really was a prince, afraid her adequate lessons might take over her reactions to him. He also didn't tell her that he was betrothed. Already he was revealing so much. He didn't want to overcomplicate their first real-life meeting with every little detail of his life. There would be time for those conversations later, and the idea of telling her he was promised to another made his heart ache. If someone told me they could get me out of this forest, I think I would do anything they said, she muttered, staring unseeing into the canopy of leaves. Magical lessons, gifts, and curses that always find a way to come true. An immortal guardian who tested you and found you worthy. If it's any consolation, your life is far more interesting than any of my stories. He laughed. I'd rather hear those. Briar Rose explained more about her life, with her aunts and the sheer loneliness of it all. The most recent argument she'd had with her aunts had been sparked by their insistence that she remain at home for her birthday and that they would handle any celebration. They were obviously keeping secrets, but instead of admitting it, they were breaking her trust. All she wanted was honesty and freedom. Today they sent me out for berries, but it was clearly a lie that they needed them, she said and huffed. I'm so tired of the lying. We could run away together. I've got a horse, and you've got a dozen maps and languages up there, he said, and tapped her temple. We could make it pretty far. She leaned into his touch, giving him goosebumps. I'm afraid I am otherwise engaged tonight. You know, I heard your aunts teach you that as a polite way to avoid meetings you don't want to be a part of, he said, cupping her cheek in his hand. Philip had wanted to meet Briar Rose, if only out of curiosity, before their dreams had brought them closer together. Now that he had, there was something new and burning beneath his skin. He traced the line of her jaw up to the curve of her ear. We have known each other for so long, and you're still so upright and honorable. It's very frustrating. She laughed softly and reached up to grasp his hand. I promised my aunts I would spend the evening with them, and you have your own responsibilities to take care of. Run away with me. Spare me having to explain to my father how I was tricked, and I will spare you from having to feign joy at whatever surprise your aunts have for you, he said, and leaned his forehead against hers. 2 birds with 1 stone and all that. The idea of traveling across the world, only the 2 of them, wasn't wholly unappealing. Are we the birds? She asked, her nose bumping his. Or the stones? I think we're all birds to Maleficent, and she's very good at throwing stones. He drew back, stroking her hand with his thumb. So do you dream and dance with mysterious men in woods often? Only the good-looking ones, she winked, and then she stood and pressed the back of her hand to her forehead. Oh, I can't reveal such personal secrets to a stranger. It wasn't a dismissal so much as a promise that they would finish playing their roles of strangers meeting in a wood again one day. Of course, miss, I understand completely, he said, rising as well. However, I suppose since you will not run away with me, I need to get to that castle by sundown, and seeing you again would be a dream. She covered her laughter with her hand and then stopped. Sundown? It's when the sun goes down, the horizon goes below the horizon, and night begins. She rolled her eyes and groaned. Her fingers laced through his, tugging him toward a tree so like the ones from their dreams. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, leaning against his chest, and Philip wrapped one arm around her waist. The other rested against the nape of her neck. She kissed his cheek. It took everything within him not to startle from the touch, and Philip tightened his grip on her waist. More than anything, he did not want to leave her. What if this was only another dream? This is real. I could feel you doubting it, she whispered, and the rustle of her breath warm against his skin. We'll meet again, Philip. The warmth of her, the weight of her, and the realness of her against him sang in his veins. "Well, I need to leave soon, or my aunts will never let me out of their sight again," she said, smiling and gazing up at him through her lashes. "This may be the first and only time we've met, but I would prefer it not to be the last." Philip wanted rather desperately, to have her in his sights again. "Forgive me, stranger," Philip said, and laughed at her charade. "Who are you? What's your name?" She lifted her head. "Oh, my name. Why, it's... She gasped and pulled away, clutching her heart. "Oh, no, I can't, She dove back under the branch and gathered up her skirts, the image of panic. Her violet eyes were glittering with laughter. He nearly rolled his. Now that he knew how lonely she was, it made perfect sense for her to cling to play acting like this. It was fun, too. "Goodbye," she shouted. She had been alone too long, but then again, so had he. He reached out for her, but he didn't give chase like a player on a stage. "But when will I see you again?" "Oh, never!" She threw up her hands. "Never!" The smile never left her face, and Philip nearly cackled. "Never?" he called out. She leapt from stone to stone, descending the small mountain far faster than he could, and he crossed the stream in a graceful hop from shore to shore to shore. He skidded to a stop across the water from her. "Well," she said, and glanced at him over her shoulder. "Maybe someday." "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow?" He would be desperate to escape by then, and ready to share with her all that had happened before he had to face Princess Aurora's birthday, the curse, and his betrothal. "Oh, no!" She stopped to pick up her cape and basket, a wake of small animals chasing after her. "This evening!" Well, at least she knew what she wanted, and she was giving him a reason to escape the celebrations that night, if everything went well and Maleficent was defeated quickly. He waved to her. "Where?" The woods were too large for them to count on a chance meeting again. "The cottage! In the glen!" She looked back once more, smiled at him, and was gone, vanishing into the forest. Philip lingered, his arm in the air in a pull urging him to follow her, and tried to calm the odd feeling fluttering about his chest. He definitely didn't hate his dream girl anymore. This was deeper and fuller than Sybil affection. That meant he needed to speak with his father about Maleficent and his impending marriage. Eris might have lied to him, but she was right. It was time for him to be in control of his life. Even without magic, he didn't need to marry Princess Aurora. He could help without the betrothal. Philip sighed and let his arm fall, knowing how much his father would hate that. Samson moved up behind him. "There's nothing left for me to do but face my father, is there?" he asked. Samson huffed, sniffing the spot where Briar Rose's basket had been. A smear of blackberry juice stained the horse's mouth. "You thief," he muttered, and patted Samson's neck. "All right, not everything is terrible. One thing is good, so I'm going to celebrate that for a moment." Philip whooped and leapt up, letting free the trembling joy he had kept restrained. He had never been this happy, and he couldn't control it. He hadn't wanted to be wild and screaming when he met her, so he did it now. The few birds lingering around him scattered with his shriek. Samson snorted. "I found her!" He jumped to ease the energy flowing through him and bowed over, laughing into his hands. "It went better than I thought. She doesn't hate me, and talking to her was fantastic. I feel better. I think she feels better." Finally, something went right. Slowly, the anxiety of how poised he had wanted to be before her faded, and he beamed at Samson. "Don't ever tell anyone what you just saw," he said to the horse. "All right? Good. We're good now." All he needed to do was confess to his father and King Stefan and deal with Maleficent and Princess Aurora, and then he could return to Briar Rose. He might not have magic, but he was going to live for himself, not his father, from then on. Philip took a deep breath, holding tight to the hope that meeting Briar Rose had brought to life in him, and nodded. Let's go, he said. Time to be brave and finally be Prince Philip.